What's up everyone, welcome to a new video, and today we want to give you an insight into the racing, the slalom X racing. Everything that happens on fin. Foiling is very different, so that's going to be in a completely separate video, but today we focus on starts. We're going to focus on the reaches, how do you overtake people, we're going to focus on the jibes, and of course we will be talking about the sausage, and we hope that this will make you enjoy watching racing more because you understand what's going on in our heads, the tactics we can take, what we're thinking. So this video is for you if you're interested in watching windsurfing races, if you want to get into racing, or if you are already a racer. Pretty much for everyone who's interested in what we're doing out there in competitions. Just a little disclaimer up front, because in racing things are sometimes a bit different than in free sailing, and you have factors around you which you cannot control or can only control very limited. One of them is of course the other riders around you, and that makes things quite complicated and makes them also sometimes obvious in hindsight. When you watch the footage afterwards, you look at it and you clearly see what would have been the right decision, and that sometimes makes decisions very instinctive, and that's part of the reason why you don't see so many young guys in windsurf fin racing dominating, because it's something that you gain over years with experience. So you have to live those situations over and over again. You have to do many races to instinctively take the right decision and become a better sailor like that. So in the PWA we do a downwind slalom, which is pretty much the fastest course you can sail on your windsurf board. It's high adrenaline, it's fast, and it's pretty straightforward because you finish first, you win. The starting procedure we have is what we call a flying start. So we will get a countdown of 4 minutes at the starting boat. The starting line consists of the starting boat and the so-called pin end, which is downwind. If you cross the line before 0, you have basically a premature start and you're out for the race. They will call everyone back to the boat, because if you have a premature start, you can ruin someone else's race. So they need to abandon the whole race. So starting well is crucial, and we can divide the start into basically 3 different types of start. Of course, you always want to be on time, you always want to be at 0, ideally with maximum speed. You have a boat start, you have the middle start, and you have the pin end start. Typically the pin end and the boat are more crowded. They are more crowded because it gives you a more direct indication of where the line is. You know that as soon as you pass the boat or as you pass the pin, you cross the line. Whereas when you're in the middle, you don't have those reference points. So starting at the boat or at the pin, first of all, is a bit safer because you know exactly where you are. If you start at the boat, you're going to start upwind, which allows you to go faster because you're on a faster course, you're going more downwind. On the other hand, it means that you have to overtake the people who are downwind of you, because the pin end is always slightly forward. If you start at the pin end and you're not fast enough, as you can see for example with Matteo right here, I am on top of him, Matteo is below me, and he's slightly late at the start, and he's straight away getting the bad winds from me. Being covered by someone straight away from the start is something you want to avoid. And then you have the middle start, which is a really interesting one. It's typically not that crowded in the middle. Usually you have the middle kind of for yourself, or you only share it with one other person. It's risky though, because you don't see the line, and it's much harder to make an accurate start from the middle. We can, for example, see Pierre here, who has basically the whole middle for himself. And it really pays off because he has room to the top, he has room to the bottom. No one is rolling him straight away. So even if you have a little bit of a bad start, you have yourself some room to accelerate and to go downwind and to kind of catch up with the others. We have that start from me here as well, where I kind of start a bit late, but since I'm by myself in the middle, I have a bit of room to kind of stay out of the trouble. And especially if you do a good start at the middle. For example, we can look at this one here from Jordi, who's basically a little bit upwind from the pin, so it's not the middle, but it's kind of near the middle, and he has a lot of room. He nails the start and he just flies out of the starting line. So starting in the middle can pay off if you time your start well, but also just to stay out of trouble if you see that a lot of people are at the boat, a lot of people are at the pin. So surprisingly, there's not so much about the reach itself. Usually it's kind of connected to the jibes, and the most important thing about the reach is of course the speed. You need speed, and that's something that you get with training and testing and optimizing your gear. It's something we did here on this channel in some of the other videos. We will link it down below for you so you can understand what it takes to get faster, and what you want to do with your speed is to control the others. As soon as you have the chance to overtake someone from the top, you want to do it. You want to go down in front of them and you want to give them the bad winds that your sail creates behind you, because that's going to slow them down, and they have no other chance than pulling upwind behind you, and that way you can control them. Whereas when you're downwind, you want to sail them upwind. You want to make sure that they have to follow your course. Of course, you have to do it in a way that makes sense in context of the race. Okay, so you cannot go crazy upwind, you cannot go crazy downwind. And as soon as someone is on the edge of going too far upwind or too far downwind, that opens up that small door for you where you could potentially overtake that person. So let's say someone tries to sail you upwind, upwind, upwind to control you. You can then overtake that person downwind. So you're going to go down behind him and use that extra speed. But in that moment, you need to use the surprise effect, and you want to stay in the bad winds of that person as short as possible. So what you're going to do is you're going to get as close as possible to that person, and while he or she is sailing you upwind, you cross that person, you cross behind that person as close as possible. Because behind that person, basically it opens up a triangle of poor winds. So the closer you are to that person, the smaller space you have with bad winds. So you cross right behind that person when that person doesn't expect it. You use the extra speed you generate through going downwind, because when you go downwind you can accelerate, and that's one opportunity to overtake someone on the reach. So this right here is a very interesting situation on the second reach where I'm doing exactly that. So I'm shooting downwind. You can clearly see how I'm shooting downwind behind Cedric here, approaching the jump. I know that he might slow down a bit before the obstacle, so I'm using that moment, also that moment of surprise, because his eyes are kind of focused on the jump and his mind as well. So I'm using that moment because it's least expected. I'm shooting downwind behind him, yeah, thanks to the obstacle as well, I'm able to overtake him here downwind. So as mentioned, since 2024 we have the Slalom X, where we sometimes have obstacles in the course. Mostly it's on the second reach and on the way out. On the way out it's a bit easier to jump, and that's interesting because sometimes you have to slow down a bit before the sausage. That makes the race interesting because it slows it down and then you have to re-accelerate. So you can really see who has a better acceleration and of course who has a better jumping technique, who needs to take out the least speed and keeps the most speed in the jump. Generally we can say the more you're under pressure from people behind you or around you, the more risk you need to take at the sausage. But what does risk mean in terms of the sausage? The first one is of course the speed that you have while you're approaching the sausage, whether you're slowing down or not. The faster you go, the less time you have to decide which is the right wave or chop to jump off from. If you go a bit slower, you give yourself a bit more time to decide. On top of that, going a little bit more into the wind makes jumping easier because you have the wind catching under the nose of the board, which gives you more lift. Whereas jumping downwind, you have the opposite. You have the wind pushing on the nose, and that actually doesn't help to jump high. So you need a better wave or a better chop or a better technique to jump full speed downwind. And obviously when you go into the wind, you're kind of braking, you're slowing down. So here's really high risk, high reward. If you go full speed and you go downwind, like I mostly do, I'm usually able to get a little advantage at the sausage. Then you can carry through with a lot of speed. And we have this clip right here, for example, where I'm overtaking Jordi, or where I'm at least able to gain some more distance to Jordi by doing a really proper jump, fully downwind, keeping a lot of speed. And you can see Jordi here is really slowing down, is going upwind, buying him time to find the right wave. Perhaps he didn't have the right chop lining up for him, or perhaps he was a little cautious, but he's slowing down. This can really create a big advantage when you jump over the sausage. When approaching the sausage, you always have to start looking at the waves 5 seconds ahead before you reach the sausage. You have to kind of look upwind and further out from the sausage and estimate which wave will arrive at what point, so you can perfectly hit it to jump over it. And that's a bit the tricky part. You need a lot of anticipation, so you need kind of experience in how the waves move. And then the really tricky part is that on places like Fuerteventura or even on Tenerife, you have big swell mixed with wind waves. So you have swell from one direction and you have the wind waves that come with the wind, and that creates a big crisscross, and it's really hard to read what is a small chop created by the wind and what is the big swell. Generally, the big swell gives you more lift, it has more power. When you hit a big swell with a small chop on top, you hardly have to do anything. You are already higher than the sausage, you just lift your legs a little bit and the jump kind of creates himself. Whereas if you do the opposite, if you're in between two big rolling waves and you can't find a small chop to jump over the sausage, you're pretty much screwed, because you need to jump so hard, you need to pull up your legs as much as you can just to somehow lift the fin over it. And that sometimes creates this funny situation where the tail of the board comes higher than the nose, and you might make the sausage, you might clear it, but you might nosedive right after the sausage. So that's a bit the tricky part. So it becomes a lot about timing and experience, and also trust in your jump. Jibes are so insanely important, and especially at the first jibe, you can gain so many places if you do it right. There's a million of different lines that you can take into the jibes. But the number one determining factor, especially in spots like Fuerteventura, like Tenerife, is the swell. Because the swell is always more powerful than the wind. We have a great example here of me trying to get planing, being powered up in the sail, but because I'm pushing against the back of the wave, I'm not moving forward. I cannot overstress this. You always have to jibe in line with the waves, even when you're fully powered up. So I always want to come out of the jibe on top of the wave, so I can accelerate down the wave and I don't have to push against it, whether it's strong wind, whether it's light wind, or whether it's medium wind. So looking at the wave is super important, and that can sometimes mean that you need to slow down a bit more than you want before a jibe, just to make sure you hit the swell in the right way to come out close to the mark. Or it can mean that you don't come out close to the mark of the jibe, but at least you are coming out of a swell and you get away better. And that really kind of screws with the race and the tactics a little bit, because sometimes you want to arrive to the mark as fast as possible and go into the jibe as fast as possible, but you actually sometimes need to wait a bit more, which makes the gap between you and the person behind you closer, which is something you don't want. But coming out of the jibe well with the wave is just so much more important. When you jibe on the way in, for example on the first reach and on the first jibe, the swell matters a bit less, because here you don't need it to push you, you're actually going against the swell coming out. But still, you kind of want to look for a clean spot where you don't have crazy waves, especially if you are jibing not under pressure. If you don't have so many people around you, mostly you just make sure that you have a nice spot to jibe. But coming into the first jibe, you don't really have that comfort, so you need to jibe wherever the mark is, because you're fighting against all the other people and you don't want to lose any meters. And obviously the perfect ideal line is to come in wide, so with a lot of distance to the mark, and then exit tight around the mark. Because exiting tight gives you room to go downwind after the jibe and to accelerate, especially if you kind of have a free line and people fight for spots, people come in too fast into the jibe and make mistakes. If you come out tight, you have more free wind, you can accelerate, and that can really allow you to overtake quite some people if you do a good jibe. On the other hand, if you start downwind, or if you're pretty far downwind on the reach, you will arrive pretty tight to the mark and you will have to exit wide. It's not ideal, but the last reach, the finish reach, is always the downwind. So you often see that happening on the last jibe, that people will try to just squeeze around the mark to overtake someone, to come really close around the mark, and then do a wide jibe far away from the buoy and end up far outside. You once again, of course, have the factor that you cannot control, which are the other people around you, because you simply don't know what they are going to do, and you need to try to anticipate that a little bit. You want to stay out of trouble, you don't want to crash with someone, so sometimes you cannot take the line that you want to take. You cannot go tight because you think, oh, that person is going to do that, but in reality they do something completely different. But one other technique to avoid all that trouble, especially when the wind is patchy, is to just go a little bit further than the mark, because then you kind of finish your jibe, you shift, and you have pressure again in the sail in an area where there's still some wind. Because often when you just go 4 or 5 meters further than the mark, you have pretty much clear wind, and if you can get planing in that area, you might be able to pass that area where the water is messy, where all the people are getting stuck. You might get past that area really nicely, which is something you can see me doing here, actually here on purpose. Sometimes it can help you, it can also go wrong, because if everyone does a nice jibe and has good wind and the wind is strong and you do that, you just lose meters to the others. But in some situations this can really create an advantage, and it did for me here. Now of course there are a million other possibilities for the jibe, which is what makes racing so exciting. There's basically endless possibilities of outcomes, and if we cover every possibility in this video, it will probably end up being a 2-hour video. So that's something we won't do today, but I hope that this gives you a little bit of an insight into our mind, into what options we have, what we can do, what we sometimes want to do and cannot do. It's a tricky sport, and that makes it pretty much the best sport in the world, because there's so many little elements, there's so much to coordinate. I mean, you guys know it, just jibing in free water is already a mission sometimes. If you ever want to try racing, I will encourage you to do it, because it's really fun, even just racing your buddies out there. And with that said, that's already the end of the video. If you have any more questions, leave them in the comments. I'm always super happy if you answer them for each other. Sometimes I will chip in my opinion as well. We read all of your guys' comments, so be sure to leave one, and stay tuned for the next competition.